On the second morning of March 1883, a Korean picture bride named Soon-hee, a woman who had crossed an ocean carrying nothing but her mother's ribbon and a signed marriage paper, knelt in the frozen mud outside the Cutler ranch house and spat blood onto the porch step where Sheriff Reeves had just spat on her. The Cutler brothers, who owned 4,000 acres and every vote in that county, had come to watch the greenhorn wife get sent back to the depot in shame. Everyone in Cross Timber expected her gone by the Friday stage. What she did instead, 3 hours later, kneeling over the very man who had spat at her, splinting his shattered leg with barn slats and her own petticoat, would be the story the county told for the next 30 years. The man she knelt over was Colton Cutler, the rancher every hand in 3 counties feared, and every widow in town quietly admired from a distance. A man whose horse had thrown him not 30 feet from the porch, where his own kin had gathered to mock the bride his dying uncle had arranged for him sight unseen. His leg bent wrong beneath him, white bone pressing the skin, and not one of the 11 people watching moved to help. They were waiting, the way people wait for a joke to finish. Nobody in that yard thought a picture bride from Incheon could do anything but stand there and take the insult that had been thrown at her like water from a well bucket. Nobody thought she would last past the first snow on that ranch at all. What she said to Colton Cutler as she tore her own petticoat into strips, low enough that only he could hear it, was the first kind word spoken to her since she had stepped off the train, and it was the sentence that undid him. She had learned to set bone from her grandmother in a fishing village outside Incheon, where the men came home from the sea with limbs bent by rope and rock and bad luck, and where a girl who could not afford a dowry had to make herself useful in every other way a household might need. She had never imagined that skill would matter here, in this dry country of sod houses and barbed wire, where the only thing anyone valued about her was the fee her passage had cost the Cutler estate. Sheriff Reeves stood over her while she worked, his boots inches from her knees, and told her that a woman who had been bought could not doctor a man who owned her. She did not look up from the wound. She only asked him, in the English she had practiced on the ship for 6 weeks straight, to bring her the whiskey from his own saddlebag, because she had seen the flask outline against his coat, and she needed it more than his opinion. The silence that followed was the kind that changes a room. It took her 40 minutes to set the leg properly, splint it against a fence rail someone finally, grudgingly, fetched for her, and bind it so tight that Colton Cutler's face went white and then gray, and then, strangely, calm. He had not asked for her help. He had, in fact, been the loudest voice not 20 minutes earlier calling her a mistake his uncle had made from a hospital bed, a debt his family would have to feed and clothe and eventually bury. But pain has a way of stripping a man down to what he actually believes, and what Colton Cutler believed, watching her work with a concentration that never once flinched at his groaning, was that he owed her something he did not yet have a word for. When the doctor finally arrived from town 2 hours later and found the leg already set clean and true, he said only one thing before he even opened his bag. He asked who had done this work, because it was better than his own hands could manage. Colton answered before anyone else could speak. Soon he had arrived in Cross Timber 9 days before the accident, stepping off the westbound train with a photograph in her coat pocket of a man she had never met, and a paper that made her his wife, under the laws of a country she had crossed an ocean to reach. The photograph showed Colton Cutler at 22, unsmiling, standing beside a horse in front of a house that looked, in the grainy print, like something out of a story her mother used to tell about kings who lived far from the sea. The man who met her at the depot was not Colton. It was his uncle, Earl Cutler, a heavy-set rancher with a permanent squint, who looked her over the way he might look over a heifer at auction, and told her, without any greeting at all, that his nephew was 3 days out on a cattle drive, and that she would wait at the house until he returned. The ride to the ranch took most of the afternoon, past fences that seemed to run to the edge of the world, past cattle standing dull-eyed in frozen pasture, past a town so small it announced itself with a single church steeple, and then disappeared behind them just as fast. Earl did not speak to her again the whole way. When they arrived, his wife, Dora Cutler, met them on the porch, with her arms crossed and her mouth already set into the shape it would keep for the next several weeks. A thin, disapproving line that made it clear exactly what she thought of a mail-order bride, shipped in from across the Pacific, to marry into a family that had, until 3 years ago, run the largest cattle operation in the territory. Dora looked her up and down, taking in the plain traveling dress, the small bundle of belongings, the ribbon Soon-hee had tied into her braid that morning without thinking, a pale green thing her mother had pressed into her hand at the dock in Incheon. Dora asked, loud enough for the ranch hands unloading feed nearby to hear, whether the Koreans made all their women this small, or whether Colton had specifically ordered a runt. The hired men laughed. Soon-hee did not understand every word, but she understood the shape of the laughter, the same shape mockery took in any language, and she kept her eyes on the horizon where the sun was already beginning its long slide toward the hills, because she had promised herself on the ship that she would not cry in front of strangers, not once, not for the whole voyage, and not for whatever came after it. She was given a room off the kitchen, smaller than the pantry in some houses she had cleaned back home, with a cot and a washstand and a window that did not quite close against the wind. Dora told her the room was temporary, that she would move to a proper room once Colton decided whether he was keeping her, as though Soon-hee were a piece of furniture ordered on approval from a catalog, returnable within 30 days if it did not suit the room. That first night, lying awake and listening to the house settle around her, to voices in the kitchen discussing her in a tone that assumed she could not understand, Soon-hee thought of her grandmother's hands, of the fishing village, of the particular kind of cold that came off the Yellow Sea in winter, and she made herself a promise that had nothing to do with love or duty or the paper in her coat pocket. She promised herself she would still be standing on this land when the people currently deciding her fate had all gone quiet in the ground. It was not a hopeful thought. It was the only kind of thought that let her sleep. The days before Colton returned settled into a rhythm that told Soon-hee exactly where she stood in the household. She rose before the sun, because Dora made it clear on the second morning that a wife who slept past dawn was a wife who did not understand what she had married into, and she worked until well past dark, hauling water, scrubbing the great cast-iron stove, mending shirts with stitches so fine that even Dora, examining them by lamplight with obvious suspicion, could find nothing to criticize in the work itself. It was everything around the work that drew comment, the way she held her chopsticks-trained hands around a fork, the way she bowed her head slightly when addressed by an elder, a habit so deep in her that she could not unlearn it in 9 days no matter how many times Earl barked at her to look a person in the eye like a Christian. The way she hummed, very quietly while she worked, an old song about a boatman waiting for tide, until Dora told her to stop that heathen noise before it curdled the milk. She learned to make herself small in the corners of rooms. She learned which floorboards near the parlor creaked and avoided them, not out of fear exactly, but out of the same instinct that had kept her safe on the crowded ship. The instinct that told her the less a person like the Cutlers noticed you, the less material they had to work with. There was one exception to the coldness of that house, and it came in the shape of a boy named Wyatt, Earl and Dora's 9-year-old son, who had a bad hip from a birth that had gone wrong, and who walked with a hitch that the other ranch children mocked freely whenever their parents were not close enough to hear. Wyatt found Soon-hee on the 4th day sitting behind the smokehouse during her 1 hour of rest, and instead of the scorn she had come to expect from anyone bearing the Cutler name, he simply sat down beside her and asked, with the bluntness only a child manages honestly, whether it was true that where she came from the ocean was a different color. She told him it was the same color, mostly, but that near her village there was a stretch of water that turned the color of a bruise before a storm, yellow-green and strange, and that the old fishermen read it like a book before they took their boats out. Wyatt listened to this with his whole small body leaning toward her, and when she finished he told her, very seriously, that nobody else in the house asked him questions about anything. They only told him things, usually about his hip. It was the first real conversation Soon-hee had in that county, and it planted something in her that she did not examine too closely yet, a small, dangerous seed of belonging in ground she had been told 100 times was not hers to plant in. Colton Cutler came home on the 9th day, riding in at the head of 6 hands and 200 head of cattle, dust-caked and saddle-sore and in no mood, as it turned out, for the news his aunt had waiting for him on the porch. Soon he watched him from the kitchen window as Dora intercepted him before he had even dismounted, watched the way his shoulders went rigid as his aunt spoke, watched him look past her toward the house with an expression that was not curiosity so much as dread, the look of a man being told a debt has come due that he had hoped might quietly disappear. He did not come inside for nearly an hour. When he finally did, he found Soon-hee at the stove, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment without speaking, taking in the small woman in the plain dress who was, according to a paper his dying uncle had signed from a hospital bed in Kansas City, now legally his wife. His uncle Silas, it turned out, had arranged the match in his final months. Convinced that Colton needed an anchor, Someone who would not run at the first hard winter the way his mother had, all those years ago when she left Earl's brother and the ranch and Colton himself, then 6 years old, standing in a doorway not unlike this one. Colton did not tell her any of this that first night. He told her only that he had not asked for a wife, that he had a ranch to run and a debt to his uncle's memory to honor, and no room in either for a woman who could not so much as speak proper English, and that she should not expect him to play husband simply because a piece of paper said the word. Soon he listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he finished, she set a plate of food in front of him, the good rice she had been rationing from her own trunk because she had heard this territory grew none, and told him, in careful, deliberate English, that she had not asked for a husband either, that she had asked for passage away from a house where she was the fourth daughter of 5 and worth exactly nothing, and that whatever he decided to call their arrangement, she intended to eat and sleep somewhere warm this winter, regardless of his opinion on the matter. Colton looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that she could not yet read, and then he ate the rice without another word, and that, for the next several months, was the entire shape of their marriage. Winter came early that year, the way it sometimes did on that stretch of plain, dropping temperatures 30 degrees in a single night and burying the cattle pens under a crust of ice that took the hands 3 days to break through. Soon he had never experienced cold like it, a cold that got into the joints and stayed there, that made the yellow sea winters of her childhood feel almost gentle by comparison, and she understood within the first hard freeze why Colton's mother had left, why the county assumed every soft thing that arrived on this land eventually broke or fled. She did not break and she did not flee, though there were nights in that small room off the kitchen when she lay under 3 blankets and still could not stop shaking, when she thought of the warm floors of her grandmother's house and had to remind herself, deliberately, of exactly why she had left them. Dora took every opportunity that winter to remind her she did not belong, commenting on her cooking, her accent, the strange dried vegetables she kept in a jar and used sparingly to season the bland ranch food, calling them, more than once, rat food in front of the hands at supper. Earl was quieter in his cruelty, but no less thorough, speaking to her only in commands, treating her presence in his house as a temporary inconvenience he was still deciding how to end. Colton remained, through all of it, strangely absent, gone most days from dawn to dusk checking fence line and feeding stock in weather that would have killed a lesser rancher's herd. And on the evenings he did appear at the table, he said almost nothing to anyone, least of all to her, though she noticed, without ever mentioning it, that he had started eating 2 full plates of whatever she cooked, and that once, when Dora made her rat food comment again, his jaw had tightened in a way that made his aunt drop the subject for the rest of the meal. It was Wyatt who told her, one afternoon while she mended his coat by the smokehouse, that his cousin Colton had not always been so quiet, that before his mother left he had been, by all the old ranch hands' accounts, a loud and laughing boy, and that something in him had simply gone still the day she rode off and never came back. Soon he filed this information away carefully, the way she filed away everything useful in that house, without yet knowing what she might do with it, only sensing, the way she sensed weather changing in her bones, that there was a wound in Colton Cutler that nobody in that family had ever thought to tend. The accident that would change everything happened on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that gave no warning of what it carried, 3 months into that first hard winter, when Colton rode out at first light to check on a section of fence the wind had been worrying loose for a week. Soon he remembered later that she had watched him go from the kitchen window, the way she often did without quite admitting to herself why, and had noticed nothing unusual in the set of his shoulders, nothing to suggest that by mid-morning he would be lying in the frozen mud of his own dooryard, with his leg bent at an angle no leg should bend. What happened, as the hands pieced it together afterward, was simple and cruel in the way accidents on that land always were. His horse had shied at a rattlesnake half frozen and sluggish in its den, thrown him hard against a fence post, and bolted back toward the barn without him, arriving riderless in a way that sent the whole ranch into a scramble long before anyone found Colton himself, conscious but white-faced, dragging himself by his forearms through the snow toward the sound of voices. By the time 2 hands got him back to the house, Sheriff Reeves happened to be present, having ridden out that very morning on an entirely unrelated matter concerning stolen cattle, and it was Reeves, more than anyone, who set the tone of what followed, standing over the injured rancher and declaring, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, that a broken leg out here was as good as a death sentence unless the bone was set clean and set fast, and that the nearest doctor was 3 hours away on a good road, which this was not. It was in that gap, that 3-hour chasm of uncertainty, with Colton gray and sweating in the mud and his own family standing frozen with indecision, that soon he stepped forward from the kitchen doorway where she had been watching, and said, in the plain, clear English she had practiced every night since arriving on this land, that she could set it herself, that she had done it before, many times, for men whose injuries were worse. Dora told her to get back inside before she made things worse with her heathen nonsense. Earl told her this was not her business. It was Sheriff Reeves who spat at her feet and told her that the last thing this county needed was a foreign woman playing doctor on a white man, and that she should know her place before she embarrassed herself further in front of people who mattered. Soon he looked at the spit in the mud near her shoe, looked at Colton's face going the color of ash, and made a decision in the space of a single breath that would define the rest of her life on that land. She knelt without asking permission from anyone, which was itself an act no one in that yard had expected from her, and began working before Reeves could finish whatever sentence he had been building toward. Her hands moved with a steadiness that surprised even her, muscle memory from a childhood spent watching her grandmother work on fishermen's crushed fingers and broken wrists, memory that had lain dormant through the ocean crossing and the humiliations of the past 9 days, and now rose up in her exactly when it was needed, as if it had been waiting the whole time for a use worthy of it. She called for clean cloth and was ignored, so she tore her own petticoat instead, the good one she had brought from Incheon, without a flicker of hesitation. She called for something rigid to splint against and was told by Earl that this was not a circus, and he would not be fetching props for her performance, so she sent Wyatt, who had appeared at the edge of the crowd with his uneven gait, running for fence slats from the barn, and the boy went without question, glad, she would understand only later, to finally have a task that mattered more than being underfoot. Colton, through all of this, watched her face rather than his own ruined leg, fixing on her the way a drowning man fixes on the one solid thing in view, and when the pain became too much and a sound escaped him that he clearly hated making in front of his family, soon he did something that stopped the whole yard cold. She leaned close to his ear and spoke to him, quietly, in Korean, a string of words meant for no one else in that crowd to understand, and though he could not know their meaning, the tone reached him the way tone always reaches a frightened animal or a frightened man, low and steady and entirely without pity, and his breathing slowed to match the rhythm of her voice. What she had said, though she would not tell him for months, was simply that pain like this passes, that bone knits itself back stronger at the break, that she had seen it 100 times and never once seen it fail, and that he should hold still and let her hands do what they knew how to do. Sheriff Reeves stood through the whole procedure with his arms crossed, waiting, it seemed, for her to fail so he could say something final and damning about foreign women and their delusions, but the leg came together clean under her hands, the swelling controlled, the bone aligned, and when she finally sat back on her heels, hands red and shaking now that the work was done, the silence in that yard was not the silence of vindication so much as the silence of people watching their entire understanding of the world quietly rearrange itself. The doctor arrived from town 2.5 hours later to find the work already done, the leg splinted with a precision that made him crouch down and examine it twice before he said a word, running his fingers along the alignment with the careful attention of a man checking whether his own eyes were lying to him. Dr. Whitfield had practiced medicine in that county for 11 years, had set more broken bones than he could count on cowhands who had been thrown, dragged, gored, and crushed in every combination the range could produce, and he told the gathered crowd, without any softening for the moment's awkwardness, that this splint was better work than he could have managed himself, arriving fresh with his full kit, let alone what a stranger had managed in a frozen yard with fence slats and torn petticoat. He asked, directly, who had done it. Nobody answered right away. Dora's mouth opened and closed without producing words. Earl studied the middle distance. Sheriff Reeves had already found urgent business elsewhere and was nowhere in sight. It was Colton, propped against a wagon wheel with his splinted leg stretched before him, pale from pain but entirely lucid, who answered the question before the silence could stretch any further, saying, in a voice loud enough to carry across the whole yard, that his wife had done it, that she had known exactly what to do while every other person present had stood around deciding whether it was proper to help him. The word wife landed in that yard like a dropped plate. It was the first time Colton had used it in front of his family, the first time in 3 months he had claimed her as anything other than an obligation his uncle had saddled him with, and soon he, standing at the edge of the group with her ruined petticoat and blood-stained hands, felt something in her chest that she did not have a name for yet, something between vindication and a fear that this moment would prove as temporary as everything else kindness had offered her since she left home. The doctor, unaware of the weight the word carried, simply nodded and began instructing her on how to keep the wound clean and the leg immobile over the coming weeks, addressing her directly, as a colleague might, which was its own kind of small revolution in that yard full of people who, an hour earlier, had told her plainly to know her place. The weeks that followed Colton's injury rearranged the household in ways no one announced out loud but everyone quietly registered. Confined to a chair by the fire with his leg propped and immobile, unable to ride the fence line or run the cattle he had spent his whole life tending, Colton found himself, for the first time since his mother left, entirely dependent on someone else's hands, and those hands belonged to the wife he had spent 3 months pointedly ignoring. Soon he changed his dressing every morning and every evening, checked the alignment of the bone with the same careful attention Dr. Whitfield had praised, and in the long empty hours between those tasks, when Dora and Earl were occupied with the ranch business that did not stop simply because its heir was laid up, she and Colton began, slowly and without either of them quite deciding to talk. He asked her, the 3rd week, why she had learned to set bone in the first place. And she told him about her grandmother, about the fishing village, about a childhood spent making herself useful, because usefulness was the only currency a 4th daughter possessed. She asked him, in turn, about the mother he never mentioned, and watched him go very still in his chair, the same stillness Wyatt had described to her weeks before, and for a long moment she thought he would not answer at all. But he did, eventually, in a voice stripped of its usual guardedness, telling her that his mother had left on a morning much like this one, cold and gray, and that he had stood in the doorway watching her wagon disappear down the road and had waited, for years afterward, for some sign that she was coming back, a letter, a visit, anything, and that when none came he had simply decided that wanting things from people was a habit that only ever ended in standing in doorways watching them leave. It was the most he had said to anyone about it in 15 years, and soon he understood, hearing it, exactly why he had greeted her arrival with such flat refusal. Why a wife arranged by a dying uncle's hand had looked to him like nothing more than another door he would eventually watch someone walk through. She did not offer him comfort in words, sensing correctly that words would only make him retreat further into the chair, into himself. She simply kept coming back every morning with clean cloth and steady hands, day after day, proving something to him that no promise could have proven nearly as well. Dora Cutler watched the growing ease between her nephew and his foreign wife with an expression that curdled further each week, and by the start of the 5th week of Colton's recovery, she had stopped pretending civility was worth the effort. She began speaking about Soon-hee in the 3rd person even when Soon-hee stood directly in the room, a habit meant to remind everyone present exactly how much weight her presence carried in that house, which was to say none at all in Dora's accounting. She told Colton more than once and never quietly that a man in his condition needed a nurse, not a wife, and that once his leg healed, there would be time enough to discuss what to do about the arrangement his uncle had forced on him, phrasing that made clear she still considered the marriage a temporary embarrassment rather than a fact. Earl, for his part, grew more direct as the weeks wore on, cornering Soon-hee one afternoon by the well and telling her, without any pretense of kindness, that the ranch had debts his brother's estate had left behind, debts that a picture bride from Korea did nothing to solve, and that she should not mistake a man's gratitude for a broken leg with any lasting claim on his name or his land. Soon he listened to all of it the way she had learned to listen to unkindness since arriving in that county, absorbing it without visible reaction, filing it away, continuing her work. But something had shifted in her that Earl and Dora both failed to account for, a shift that had begun the moment she knelt in the mud and would only deepen with every week that followed. She had stopped waiting for their approval. She no longer moved through that house trying to make herself invisible, trying to earn a welcome that she had come to understand would never be freely given regardless of how well she cooked or how quietly she worked. She began, instead, to move through it as though she belonged there, because in the one way that mattered most, in the way a doctor had confirmed in front of the entire ranch, she did. Colton noticed the change before either of his relatives did, watching her cross a room now with her chin level instead of dropped, watching her meet Dora's cold stares instead of ducking them, and something in him that had been guarded and gray since childhood began, very slowly, to warm toward the sight of it, the way frozen ground warms toward the first real thaw of a late season, imperceptibly at first and then, all at once, undeniably. It was Wyatt who first said out loud what everyone else in that house had begun, in their separate and private ways, to sense. He found Soon-hee one evening mending by lamplight in the kitchen after supper, Colton already dozing in his chair by the fire in the next room, and asked her, with the same directness that had made her trust him from their first conversation behind the smokehouse, whether she loved his cousin yet, or whether that was a thing that took longer for grown people than it seemed to in the stories his mother read him. Soon-hee's needle stopped moving. She told him, carefully, that love was a complicated thing between grown people, more complicated than in stories, but that she had stopped being afraid of Colton somewhere in the last month, and that fear leaving a room, she thought, was usually the first sign something better was arriving to take its place. Wyatt considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything, then told her that he hoped Colton kept her because the house had been quieter, in a good way since she'd arrived, that his cousin laughed sometimes now, actually laughed, at things she said in the evenings, and that nobody else in the family had managed that in all the years Wyatt could remember. He told her too, in a rush, as though he had been holding on to it for days, that he had heard his mother and father talking the night before, through the wall of his room, discussing what might happen once Colton's leg fully healed, discussing whether there might be a way to end the marriage cleanly before Colton got any more attached, discussing an annulment his uncle Silas, apparently, had never properly filed the paperwork to make impossible to contest. Soon he felt the floor of her careful new confidence tilt beneath her at those words. She had begun, without fully admitting it to herself, to imagine a future on this land, imagining it in the small, unguarded moments Wyatt had just described, Colton's rare laughter, his hand brushing hers when she changed the dressing, the way he had started saying her name correctly instead of stumbling over it the way he had those first weeks. She thanked Wyatt for telling her, and meant it, and sent him to bed, and sat alone in the kitchen for a long while after, turning Earl and Dora's whispered plan over in her mind, like a stone she could not yet see all the sides of, understanding that whatever peace she had found in that house over the past month might be far more fragile than the mended bone in the next room. She did not sleep that night, turning over every possible response to what Wyatt had told her, and by the time the sky outside her small window had gone from black to the deep blue that came before dawn, she had decided on the only course that felt true to the promise she had made herself that first sleepless night in this house, months ago now, the promise to still be standing on this land long after the people currently deciding her fate had gone quiet in the ground. She would not beg, she would not plead her case to Earl and Dora, would not throw herself on their mercy or Colton's affection as though her right to remain depended on either. Instead, she rose before the household stirred and walked out to the barn where the ranch ledgers were kept, and by lamplight, working through account books she had watched Earl squint over for months without ever being asked her opinion, she began to see the shape of something the whole family had apparently missed or was too proud to address directly. The ranch's debts were not simply bad luck, as Earl liked to describe them, but the specific and traceable result of 2 seasons of buying cattle at the wrong time and selling them at the wrong time, decisions made, the dates confirmed, entirely by Earl himself while Colton had been occupied elsewhere. She was no rancher, but she had helped keep her own family's small trading accounts back home since she was 12, had an eye for numbers that had gone entirely unused in this household because nobody had thought to ask a picture bride whether she could read a ledger. When Colton woke that morning and found her already gone from the house, and later found her in the barn surrounded by open account books with a look of fierce concentration on her face, he asked what on earth she was doing. She told him, plainly, that if his aunt and uncle intended to argue she brought nothing of value to this family, she intended to make certain that argument could not survive contact with the actual numbers, and she turned the ledger toward him and began, in her careful, precise English, to walk him through exactly what she had found. What she showed him that morning changed something fundamental in how Colton Cutler saw the woman he had married under protest and grown, slowly and against every instinct he'd built since his mother left, to depend on. The numbers were undeniable once laid out in her patient hand-copied summary. Earl had made 3 significant buying decisions in the past 2 years, each one driven not by market sense but by a stubborn refusal to admit the previous purchase had been a mistake, compounding losses that he had quietly been covering by drawing down the reserve his own dead brother, Colton's father, had built over 20 careful years. Colton sat with the ledgers for the better part of an hour, his face moving through disbelief and then a slow, cold anger, Not at Soon-hee for finding it, but at himself, for not seeing it sooner, for trusting an uncle's management so completely that he had never once thought to check the man's arithmetic. When he finally looked up at her, he did not thank her in words, not at first. He simply reached over and took her hand, the first time he had done so without the excuse of a wound needing tending, and held it for a long moment in the cold barn air, and told her that he intended to bring this to Earl directly, in front of Dora, and that whatever happened afterward, whatever his aunt and uncle decided to say about foreign wives and annulments and debts, the ranch itself now owed her a debt it could never fully repay. She told him, quietly, that she had not done it to be owed anything, that she had done it because she did not intend to leave this place quietly if it came to a fight, and something in that sentence, the plain, fierce refusal buried inside it, made Colton look at her the way he had looked at her once before, in the mud, the day she set his leg, as though he were seeing the actual shape of her for the first time, rather than the shape his family had trained him to expect. He asked her, then, straightforwardly, whether she wanted to stay, whether this marriage was something she wanted to keep, or simply something she was too proud to lose. Soon-hee did not answer right away. She looked out through the barn door at the frozen fields beyond, at the wheat-gold stubble under frost, and took her time deciding exactly how honest she was ready to be. The confrontation Colton promised came 2 days later, in the parlor, with Earl and Dora seated stiffly across from him while Soon-hee stood by the window with the ledgers in her hands, and it did not go the way Earl had clearly expected any conversation involving his nephew's foreign wife to go. Colton laid out the numbers without softening a single figure, his voice level in a way that unsettled Earl more than shouting would have, explaining exactly how much of his father's reserve had disappeared into decisions Earl had made without consultation, and then quietly absorbed rather than admit, and watching his uncle's face move from denial to bluster, to something that finally, grudgingly, resembled shame. Dora tried, twice, to redirect the conversation toward the annulment she and Earl had discussed in whispers through the bedroom wall, suggesting that whatever the ledgers showed, the marriage itself remained a separate matter, one that did not have to involve a foreign woman with no real claim on this family's future, regardless of her usefulness with numbers or bones. It was here that Colton said the thing that would be repeated, in one version or another, across that county for years afterward, told at church socials and barn dances and over back fences, until it took on the polish of legend. He told his aunt and uncle, in front of the wife they had spent months trying to erase from the family's future, that he had spent 15 years watching people leave this land, his mother first, and then, in smaller, quieter ways, every person who had ever suggested he was not worth staying for, and that he had decided, kneeling in mud with a shattered leg while his own family debated whether helping him was proper, that he was done being a man who let other people decide who was allowed to stay. He told them that Soon-hee had set his leg when not one of them moved to help, had found the debt that would have ruined this ranch within 2 more seasons when not one of them had thought to look, and had done both without once asking anything from this family in return, except the basic decency of being seen as a person rather than a transaction. He told them finally that if they could not find a way to treat his wife with the respect her actions had more than earned, they were welcome to make other arrangements for their own future on this land, because the ranch, as of that morning, and as it had legally been since his father's death, was his to decide, not Earl's, and never again anyone's but his and hers together. The silence that followed Colton's declaration stretched long enough that Soon-hee could hear the clock in the hallway marking each second, and she watched Earl's face cycle through several responses before he finally settled on the one that would define the rest of that difficult winter. Not apology, which was apparently beyond him, but retreat, a grudging, wordless acceptance that the balance of power in that house had shifted somewhere in the past 2 months and was not shifting back. Dora was not so easily silenced, rising from her chair to declare that she would not be lectured about family loyalty by a nephew who had let a foreign stranger turn him against the people who raised him, and storming from the room in a fashion that would have been more dignified, soon he thought privately, if it had not ended with Dora catching her heel on the parlor rug and stumbling into the doorframe on her way out. Nobody laughed, though Wyatt, watching from the hallway where he had clearly been listening the whole time, caught Soon-hee's eye for just a moment with an expression that suggested he very much wanted to. In the days that followed, the household did not transform into something warm and easy, not immediately, not with Dora's resentment still radiating from every room she occupied, and Earl's silence carrying its own particular chill. But something essential had changed regardless. a line drawn and held, and soon he found that she no longer flinched when Dora entered a room, no longer made herself smaller in the corners, because she understood now, in a way she had not fully believed even after setting Colton's leg, that she had a place on this land that did not depend on anyone else's approval to be real. Colton's leg continued healing through those weeks, the limp growing less pronounced with each passing day, and as he regained his strength and his ability to work the ranch himself again, he began including her in decisions no rancher's wife in that county was typically consulted on, asking her opinion on cattle purchases, on which hands to keep through the lean months, on whether the debt Earl had created should be addressed by selling off a section of the northern pasture or by tightening the household budget instead. She gave her opinions plainly, the way she had given them over the ledgers, and Colton listened to them the way a man listens to someone he has decided, somewhere in the past 2 months, to trust completely. Word of what had happened at the Cutler Ranch traveled through cross timber the way news always traveled in a county too small to keep secrets, passing from ranch hand to shopkeeper to preacher's wife until, within a month, most of the town had heard some version of the story. The foreign bride who had set the rancher's leg in the mud while the sheriff spat at her, the ledgers she had found that saved the family from ruin, the husband who had chosen her, publicly and unmistakably, over his own aunt and uncle. Not everyone in town received the story kindly. Some, particularly among the older ranching families who had known Colton's father and held old-fashioned notions about who belonged on this land and who did not, muttered that a man ought not let a foreign wife run his business, that Colton Cutler had gone soft since his accident, that the whole affair reflected poorly on a family that had once commanded real respect in that county. But others, and their number grew steadily as the weeks passed, told the story differently, with something like admiration threaded through it, particularly the women of the town, who understood better than most exactly what it cost a woman to stand her ground in a room full of people determined to make her small. Soon he herself remained largely unaware of how widely her story had spread, occupied as she was with the daily work of the ranch and the slower, more private work of building something real with the man she had married as a stranger, until the day Sheriff Reeves himself rode out to the Cutler Ranch, unannounced, dismounting in the same yard where he had once spat at her feet, and stood there for a long moment before removing his hat, an act of respect she had never once seen him extend to anyone in that county, least of all her. He did not apologize in so many words, men like Reeves rarely did, but he told her, stiffly, that he had misjudged what a person was capable of based on where she had come from, and that he had ridden out that day specifically to say so before the winter ended, because a man ought to correct an error before it hardened into something permanent. Soon he accepted this the way she accepted most things now, with quiet grace rather than triumph, though she noted, privately, the particular satisfaction of watching a man who had once told her to know her place remove his hat in her own dooryard. By the time the first real thaw arrived in late February, the Cutler Ranch had settled into a rhythm none of its residents could have predicted the previous autumn. Earl remained on the property, but had ceded all major decisions to Colton, spending his days on smaller, less consequential tasks that kept him occupied without requiring anyone to trust his judgment on money again. Dora's resentment had not fully dissolved, but it had thinned into something more like resigned distance, a wary politeness she extended to Soon-Hee in front of others while reserving her true feelings for moments when she believed no one was listening, moments Wyatt reported back to Soon-Hee with the loyal thoroughness of a child who had chosen his side and did not intend to waver from it. Colton's leg had healed clean and true, exactly as Soon-Hee had promised him it would that first terrible morning in the mud, leaving only a faint scar and, on cold mornings, a slight ache that he claimed, with the first real humor she had heard from him, he intended to blame on her cooking for the rest of his life. Their marriage, which had begun as an obligation neither of them wanted, had become, without either of them marking the exact day it happened, something neither of them was willing to imagine living without. He told her this directly one evening in March, a year almost to the day since she had first stepped off the train into a county that wanted nothing to do with her, sitting together on the porch where Sheriff Reeves had once spat at her feet, watching the sun go down over land that had slowly, stubbornly, become hers as much as his. He told her that he had spent 15 years believing that wanting things from people only ended in watching them leave, and that she had proven him wrong in the most inconvenient way possible, by refusing to leave no matter how hard his family had tried to make her, by staying through cold and cruelty and doubt until staying itself became its own kind of proof. Soon he, listening to this with the ribbon from her mother's hand still tied faithfully into her braid after a year of frontier winters, told him that she had made herself a promise the first night in that house, a promise to still be standing long after the people deciding her fate had gone quiet, and that she had not expected, when she made it, that the person left standing beside her would be him. It was in April, with the ground finally soft enough for planting and the ranch settling into the steady rhythms of a new season, that the story reached its final and most talked about chapter, the one that would seal Soon Hee's place in Cross Timber's memory for a generation. A rider arrived at the ranch one afternoon, a man none of the household recognized, asking specifically for the Korean woman who had set Colton Cutler's leg the previous winter, explaining that he had ridden from a homestead nearly 40 miles east, where a rancher named Silas Bright had shattered his own leg 2 days prior in a fall from a hayloft, and that the local doctor, unavailable for another week due to an outbreak of fever in a neighboring town, had told the family there was a woman near Cross Timber whose bonework rivaled any physician's. Soon he agreed without hesitation, packing what supplies she had learned to keep ready since that first accident. And Colton, despite the ranch work waiting for him at home, insisted on riding with her the full 40 miles. Unwilling, he told her simply, to let her make that journey through unfamiliar country alone, regardless of how capable she had proven herself to be. The ride took the better part of a day, through country neither of them had traveled before, past homesteads and dry creek beds, and the first green haze of spring pushing up through winter-killed grass. And when they arrived at the Bright Ranch near dusk, they found a household in the particular chaos that surrounds a serious injury in a place too far from proper medical help. Soon he worked for nearly 2 hours setting the break, more severe than Colton's had been, complicated by the 2 days that had passed since the injury and the swelling that had set in, and the Bright family watched her work with the same suspicious uncertainty the Cutlers once had, whispers passing between them about the strange foreign woman handling their patriarch's leg, until the work was done and done well, and the whispers, as they always seemed to with her, quieted into something closer to gratitude. It was as they prepared to make camp for the night before the long ride home that the second visitor arrived, a man on a lathered horse who introduced himself, with visible difficulty, as the very Sheriff Reeves whose earlier cruelty had started this whole chain of events, explaining that word of the Bright family's accident and Soon Hee's ride to help had reached Cross Timber that morning, and that he had ridden the 40 miles himself, hard, to say something he had realized could not wait any longer. Sheriff Reeves dismounted with the stiffness of a man who had pushed himself and his horse harder than either was suited to, and stood in the Bright family's dooryard breathing hard for a moment before he found the words he had apparently spent 40 miles preparing. He told Soon Hee, in front of Colton and the assembled Bright family and the 2 ranch hands who had gathered to see what the commotion was about, that he had spat at her feet the previous winter in front of the whole Cutler ranch, that he had told her to know her place, that he had spent months afterward telling himself the visit he'd already paid her, the hat removed in her dooryard, had settled the matter properly between them. But he told her that hearing, that very morning, how she had ridden 40 miles on nothing but a stranger's word to set a dying man's leg, without payment discussed or promised, without any expectation beyond the simple fact that a person needed help and she was capable of giving it, had made him understand that a removed hat was not nearly apology enough for what he had done that first day. That he had judged her worth by the shape of her eyes and the sound of her English before he had bothered to learn a single true thing about her character, and that he intended, from this day forward, to make certain every person in his county knew exactly what kind of woman they had been so quick to dismiss. He told her, plainly and without the stiffness he usually carried, that he was sorry, the actual word, spoken clearly enough that even the Bright family, strangers to the whole history, understood they were witnessing something significant. Soon he accepted the apology with the same quiet grace she had shown him in her own dooryard weeks before, telling him that she held no anger toward him worth carrying 40 miles, that anger was heavy and she preferred to travel light, and that if he truly wished to make amends, the most useful thing he could do was help her explain to the Bright family how to keep Silas's leg immobilized properly over the coming weeks, since a sheriff's word would carry further with strangers than a foreign woman's instructions alone. Reeves, visibly moved by the practicality of the request, spent the next hour doing exactly that, and Colton, watching from the porch rail, felt something settle in his chest that had nothing to do with his own healed leg and everything to do with watching the woman he loved turn even an apology into something useful for someone else. News of Sheriff Reeves's 40-mile apology reached Cross Timber before Soon-Hee and Colton themselves did, carried by a bright ranch hand who rode ahead to fetch additional supplies and could not resist sharing, at every stop along the way, the sight he had witnessed of the county's most feared lawman, removing his hat and admitting fault to the Korean bride he had once humiliated in front of half the county. By the time Soon-Hee and Colton rode back into Cross Timber 2 days later, tired from the road but satisfied with a difficult job well done, the story had already taken on the shape it would keep for years, told and retold at the general store and the church social and the barn dances that marked the turning of each season, until it became less a piece of gossip than a kind of local scripture, the story people told newcomers to explain exactly what kind of woman had helped make it that way. Dora Cutler, hearing the story secondhand from a neighbor before Soon-Hee had even finished unpacking her supplies, found herself in the uncomfortable position of realizing that the woman she had spent a winter trying to diminish had become, in the space of a single spring, something closer to a local legend than a foreign burden, and though she never fully warmed into affection, she did, from that point forward, moderate her comments in public in a way that suggested even she understood which way the wind in that county had turned. Earl, for his part, seemed almost relieved to no longer be the center of the household's tension, settling into his diminished role with a quiet that Soon-Hee chose to interpret, generously, as something like acceptance. Wyatt, meanwhile, had taken to telling anyone who would listen, with the fierce pride of a child who had chosen correctly and knew it, that his cousin's wife had set a man's leg with fence slats and ridden 40 miles to save another, and that she had taught him more about courage in one winter than the rest of his family had managed in 9 years, a comment that made Dora wince every time she overheard it, and made Colton, hearing it for the first time, laugh out loud in a way the old ranch hands swore they had not heard from him since he was a boy. A year to the day after Sheriff Reeves rode 40 miles to apologize, Cross Timber held its annual spring social in the churchyard, an event that drew every family within a day's ride and had, in years past, been an occasion Soon-Hee approached with quiet dread, certain of the stares and whispered comments that had once followed her through any public gathering in that county. This year was different in ways so complete they nearly overwhelmed her when she took stock of them, standing at the edge of the churchyard in a dress Dora had, astonishingly, helped her sew for the occasion, an act of grudging peace neither woman ever spoke of directly but both understood for what it was. Sheriff Reeves greeted her by name and asked after the Bright family's recovery, a courtesy he extended to no one else that afternoon with quite the same warmth. Women who had once crossed the churchyard to avoid conversation with her now sought her out for advice, on herbs, on healing, on the particular durability required to survive a frontier winter, treating her now as a source of wisdom rather than an object of suspicion. Wyatt, taller now and walking with a hitch that had grown less pronounced under the exercises Soon-Hee had researched and taught him from an old medical text Dr. Whitfield had loaned her, ran through the gathering with the easy confidence of a boy who had never once doubted, in the year since, that the woman who arrived shamed in the mud was in fact the finest thing that had ever happened to his family. Colton found her near the end of the afternoon, standing at the edge of the gathering watching the whole scene with an expression she could not quite name, something between disbelief and a settled, quiet joy, and he took her hand the way he had first taken it in the cold barn over the ledger books, and told her that he had been wrong about everything he believed the day she arrived. Wrong that wanting things only ended in loss, wrong that his family's land had no room in it for someone who had crossed an ocean to reach it. Wrong, most of all, in ever believing for even a single evening that she had been a burden his uncle had forced upon him, rather than the one true inheritance the man had ever managed to leave him. Soon he looked out at the churchyard full of people who had once wanted her gone by the Friday stage, now gathered to celebrate a season she had helped make possible, and felt, for the first time since stepping off that train with nothing but a ribbon and a photograph of a stranger, that she had finally, fully arrived.